Let me set the stage on why we're talking about philanthropy. So last year, in the United States, charitable giving exceeded $375 billion. So that means every few years, $1 trillion is going to charity. And fully 11% of the US workforce, when you think about universities and hospitals and other types of nonprofit organizations, 11% are employed in the nonprofit sector. And there are, shockingly, 1.6 million nonprofit organizations in the United States. Now, I'll go out on a limb here and say there's probably not 1.6 million separate causes that need funding. And if this was occurring in the for-profit space, you would see a wave of M&A activity sweep in and extract value and consolidate. But we don't in philanthropy for a number of reasons, one of which is a little bit of ego. But the point is, all of this together create a very large business, and it's something that really isn't treated often enough like the business that it is. When I'm advising donors on the giving side, I say, you need to treat your philanthropy like you do your investment portfolio. And that is, you need diversification. You want to bet on winners that have the best chance of success in a very competitive marketplace. And you need to have some predetermined efficacy measures of success so that you know how you're doing, and you need a time frame, like most investments have, about when you're going to exit. And that is often shocking in the philanthropic space because I'm trying to get people to think of it as a business. And in other types of philanthropy, people tend to toe into the water. So you get invited to a fundraising dinner for the art museum or the ballet, then maybe you go to a performance and you see that they need some financial support and you provide the same by writing a check. Or a natural disaster hits and you feel compelled to join the Red Cross and donate some money. But medical philanthropy comes to you like someone threw a brick at your head, because either you are affected by somebody that you love that has a disease, or you yourself are diagnosed, and all of a sudden you are thrown into this abyss and trying to find out everything you can about the disease and where the research is going on, and you jump in with 2 feet to something that you didn't want to participate in the first place. And I think with that, I want to start down at the end, David, because that is your situation. And tell us a little bit about your journey, how when your daughter was first diagnosed with diabetes, when you looked at the landscape, what you saw, and then how you decided to begin taking the time to evaluate how you'd fund.
Sure. So my daughter was diagnosed in March of 2007. 5 months later, I found myself as a trustee of what's now a $5.5 billion trust. My wife will tell you I don't get a subtle hint. Not so much of a subtle hint as to what I should be doing with my life, except I had no idea how to do what I was about to embark on doing. So I come from the business world. That is intuitive to me. So I spend a lot of time learning, and it's a little ironic I'm on a panel with Todd because the Michael J. Fox Foundation was one of the groups that I spent a lot of time with very early on, and I think the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation would be the other, and those were two of a handful of public charities that were really having major impacts on their diseases. And what was a common thread was a business approach to their work. So for me, what that really meant was doing the diligence, understanding the landscape, and understanding the role of philanthropy within that landscape. So it's very different, and I can give you a really good example. What we started looking at as we did the landscape, where is the data on people? And at least in the type 1 diabetes space, it really did not exist. It existed in academic silos that you could not get to it. And we decided that we were going to take that on. And we built what's now called the T1D Exchange, and it's a longitudinal data set on 28,000 people with type 1 diabetes. It's married to a biobank and a patient community. And the beauty of all this is type 1 back 10 years ago when I first started, it was thought to be a safe and managed disease. It's the only disease I know of where patients and caregivers make a dosing decision with a drug that can kill them. They make those decisions 24/7, and if they're right 60% of the time, they're doing amazing. And in our disease, we have, in our 28,000 people, less than 30% of people are achieving outcomes as recommended by the ADA. And these are the best clinics in the country. So we're failing pretty miserably. So when we started to collect this data, I myself went and presented the data to the FDA, and they were absolutely floored because they thought type 1 was safe and managed. And we now had data that showed 30% of people achieving outcomes, 10% of people were having severe hypoglycemic events and ending up in an ER. And those are the kind of things that the payers really start to care about. And I'll wrap up quick, Rich. I see you giving me the look. But when you think about it cost us over $100 million to build over 8 years because you had to pay the docs, you had to pay the clinicians, you had to pay the patients. There was no easy way to get the data. But if we didn't do it, nobody else would have. The public charities, because they have a different model, are not in a position to fund something that takes 3 years and costs upwards of $100 million to go ahead and do it. And I really believe it's philanthropy's job to step in, understand the full landscape. Don't just write a check to the guy in a white coat and hope that the right thing happens.
I think that's a good point because in medical research, the philanthropic dollar is about 3% of the total, but it can actually have an outsized impact and can take greater risk. Perhaps it's not expecting the same kind of return. LaTese, I want to go to you because as David was confronted with this, and you mentioned doing a landscape, I know that we do that a lot at the Institute with you and your team. How do you go about even identifying who the stakeholders are in a given disease space, and then how do you engage them in the process? Mm-hmm.
So first thing I'll say when you're looking to do a landscape is, don't just focus on who are the scientists, right? You certainly want to understand who those scientists, who the researchers and clinicians are, but also figure out who are the other stakeholders, if there are other nonprofits in the space, who are they and what are they doing? What partnerships have they built? What's the funding agency that is giving money for your disease areas? So you really have to take a holistic approach because otherwise you get this skewed perspective and you never really get to the nuance of the challenges in that disease that's creating these roadblocks, right? You end up with what David was saying with the FDA thinking diabetes that's fine. Those patients are doing great, it's manageable, and that's not the case. In terms of how do you engage, it's simple. You engage authentically. When you are looking, and of course, you reframe it depending on who you're engaging, right? How you engage a scientist is a little bit different from how you engage the NIH. But if you come to it from a place of authenticity, right, which I think most of in this room, we come at our issues, whatever that is, from a place of passion. Bring that passion and that authenticity. People will listen to you. And if they don't engage, then that's not who you want on your team. But it's also good to know who those people are as well when you're trying to get the lay of the land. And as we were before we came in here, we were talking about how a lot of organizations, and right now I'm just talking about, just some of the nonprofits, right? Not let alone the scientists. There's bad blood. And you try to map the history of it, and you just can't figure out, well, why is there bad blood? We're all trying to work to save people's lives. So, when you're doing that landscape, it's important, again, to understand the science, to understand the system, but don't forget about, taking into account the dynamics of people and people relationships, because that's just as important as you embark on your journey.
Thank you. So, Todd, David brought you into it as a model, and I think that Michael J. Fox operates kind of as a little bit of a hybrid between the two. But tell us, how do you make funding decisions based upon the landscape as LaTese just laid out, where there could be some conflict and people not always willing to be good partners? I mean, how do you tackle that?
Yeah, I think both David and LaTese hit on this, which is to really find within the activities in the disease where you think your funding and activities are going to make a difference. So if there's an institution or a group that has significant funding, throwing a little bit on top of that is probably not going to have the impact that you want. So really assessing what's a unique role that you could be playing. And one area is really related, I think, to these patient cohorts that we talked about, how everyone wants the data. So who's going to generate that data? Who's going to bring those cohorts together, and I think it is a role that philanthropy can help with. In terms of sort of how to encourage collaborations, I think it's setting a standard. LaTese said this, walking the walk, that you have to be willing to collaborate as well, and share credit and share tools and share data with people. And I think being clear up front as you're starting initiatives what your expectations are of the group that you're going to be funding in terms of how they're going to work together. Are you going to provide the frameworks and tools where they can actually work together? And setting that up from the beginning, I think, is really important.
Mm-hmm. This notion of collaboration, before I joined Mike at the Institute, I spent my career on Wall Street, and there's always a counterparty. Right? There's always somebody that collectively makes the trade work. There's a buyer and a seller. There's an ISDA agreement, you've got counterparties. And you have a healthy competition. You don't want to take all of the risk on a very large loan. What you do is you actually disperse that risk among many players. And then through that diversification of risk, more people can participate. And if it does have a problem, people share in it equally. That's not generally the case in this space. And David, when you think of new models, and I know you've done some advisory work at the Parker Institute, et cetera, which of those models do you think are effective in creating that collaborative space?
Thank you for the question. Before I answer it, first I want to compliment Michael J. Fox. I work at a venture firm most of the time. We made an investment in part because Michael J. Fox vetted the investment. Mm-hmm. So that kind of blurred or continuum of for-profit, not-for-profit, I think has really changed substantially in the last 5 years. And my venture thing, we actually have a collaboration with Memorial Sloan Kettering, Weill Cornell, and Rockefeller, and I can talk about that, but let me focus on Sean Parker's, I think, striking undertaking. He studied the field of immunology for a long time. He thought that cancer immunotherapy was on the cusp of great things. He made a big, bold bet, $250 million, and he said, let's do this on some predicates. No bureaucracy. It's conditioned on collaboration. Let's find what is now 6 or more research institutions of the first quality, UCSF, Stanford, UCLA, MD Anderson, Penn, Memorial Sloan Kettering, and more recently, Dana-Farber. Said, let's find the best people, let's challenge them to come up with the hardest research activities. What's the effect of the microbiome on the use of cancer immunotherapy? What's the tumor microenvironment look like? How do we develop the next generation neoantigen? And let's make sure that all of those institutions are collaborating and cooperating without any bureaucracy. So there are no grant applications and there are no reviews. The scientists themselves are guiding the activity. And the commonality between that enterprise and, let's say, Chan Zuckerberg is you build a toolkit, or Jeff Bluestone, who runs Parker, calls it a sandbox, where you've got data sequencing, analytics, tumor samples, all these other things. The best scientists in the world want to actually work with each other. And you can create the glue out of that toolkit and make it accessible to people.
So we've talked a lot throughout the day about data in its various forms, big data, how data is used, et cetera. So Mark, I want to, the kind of data that you're using in parts of the world where it's not the same as we would have here, how do you go about getting the data and mapping it so that it creates something meaningful? And then what are the biggest challenges that you're facing?
Sure, thank you. Our foundation is a little bit different. We don't work on the kind of medical research that all of you work on. And it's really exciting to hear some of the advancements that are going on, not only with the technology, but the use of data. Unlike some of the earlier discussions about a philanthropist and taking on a particular issue, I have the joy of working for Jeff Skoll, who many of you know already had the Skoll Foundation doing great work around the world, supporting social entrepreneurs. In fact, I was happy at one of the panels, Last Mile Health was talked about, which was one of the Skoll grantees. In 2009, Jeff was still not satisfied with having a film company doing socially relevant films, having an investment company doing triple bottom line investments, having a foundation working on social entrepreneurs, but he was bothered by 5 threats to humanity: the Middle East crisis, water security, pandemics, climate change, and nuclear nonproliferation. So unfortunately, we didn't have one particular disease to deal with, but the idea was, could philanthropy, with its unique ability to basically take money and do whatever it wants to do, could a group, given that ability, with also access to somebody who has a film company, who has an investment company, who has a bunch of other levers to play, really make a difference on those 5 global threats? So clearly, and I lead our team working on ending pandemics, data has been one of our biggest ways to sort of have a little bit more equality in what we're trying to do, at least in the public health spectrum. I'm always envious of people in the medical field. I went to the University of Michigan, and I remember in my yearbook I said I was going into public health and preventive medicine, and everybody's like, what's that? Even my professors were like, okay, whatever. And then I turned out ending up at the University of Arizona during the hantavirus outbreak, which was an unknown infection. I was one of 2 doctors, and so it changed my life. I got to see what it meant for a new disease to emerge in a community, complete with all of the discrimination that goes with something that emerged from the Navajo reservation and was a Native American disease, not dissimilar to HIV, which was a gay disease. And we all know what happened when we let the world deal with an infectious disease in a way that discrimination ruled the way instead of good public health. So what we've been trying to do is solve the issue of finding outbreaks faster, no matter where they happen on the planet. Nobody needs to look back any further than Ebola to realize 8 months went on where we knew something was going on, but we didn't have a diagnostic. We didn't have the ability to say, hey, this is what's going on. Unacceptable. In this day and age, that is so unacceptable, and it's because of a failure of imagination for us to treat public health the way we think about every one of these painstaking diseases you deal with every single day. A global outbreak is concerned to all of us. We're in this together. So thank goodness we've had the freedom, with Jeff's support, to spend since 2009, not only looking at any pandemics, but looking at the other global threats and see where can we make the difference. And open data sharing and open tool development is really where we've landed on in finding outbreaks faster. So just really quickly, what we do is we bring the engineers together from that country, together with the human health, the animal health, and the environmental health sector. And they spend a week together in a process that we have trademarked as a foundation, which is really fun for your lawyers if they've never had an opportunity to do a trademark at a foundation. So this EpiHack process brings people from that particular area together, where the human, the animal, and the health, the environmental health people say, this is our problem, this is what we're trying to solve. And the developers from the country go, okay, they ask all the questions. This is what I learned from spending 4 years as a doctor at Google. You don't tell engineers what to do, you tell them the problem and you let them find the solution. So they go on a field trip, they visit the hospitals, the clinics, the farms, the community health centers. They figure out what tools do people have, what can they use, what can't they do, the literacy rate, and then they lock themselves away and they create the tools for that community by the end of the week, and then we fund the creation of those tools. And so our flagship longest project, and it's a long-term commitment, it may not be a long-term commitment of money, but you've got to be there to find the local resources, the telecom companies, the communities, the partnerships with the private sector that can help. All of that can be done in about a 3 to 5 year process. And we're happy to say our longest running project was with pilot project in Thailand, in Chiang Mai, is now completely supported by the Thai government, completely supported by resources in Thailand, and we're able now to replicate that on 5 different continents. The data is owned by them. The data is owned in partnership with the universities and the 3 government sectors. They want the community to have that data. They get it in real time. But for the government to have the university partnership to look at the data, to look at the metrics, to help them evaluate is something they never had before. But yet they own the data. And people often say, well, what do you guys think about the data? And we're like, we don't even see the data. I mean, our money went in to spur the catalytic ability to innovate with the government and the university using all local resources. And we think that's a really good use of philanthropic dollars.
That's great. So working on the preventive side, David, I know you have a project now that's not only focused on cure and remedy for diabetes, but also thinking through early stage prevention. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so when you look at most of the things that happen in type 1 diabetes anyway, almost all of it happens in people who already have the autoimmunity. So almost all the studies, and my other daughter, I have a second child that was diagnosed in August. She was in a clinical trial for 7 years. She had all of the markers for the disease. And I would argue at that point, once you have all of the markers, it's 100% certainty you will get the disease. It's just a matter of when. So if it were cancer, you would treat, it's just that we don't have anything to intervene with in the type 1 diabetes space yet. So almost all of the trials that happen to date are really focused on how do you end up trying to reverse disease in what I would argue people who already have the disease, like my daughter. So I really look at cure versus prevention, and I think there are two things, although I would argue prevention is eventually a cure. And as a parent, I want a cure for my children, but we have not reversed a chronic disease that I'm aware of. And to be clear, to me, cure is you wash your hands, you walk away like you never had the disease. We've certainly eradicated diseases, we've turned diseases into managed diseases, but we have not reversed chronic diseases. So we pivoted about 3 years ago towards what I call primary prevention, or what not I call, it's called primary prevention. And what that really focuses on is stopping the disease before autoimmunity happens. Because we know once you have autoimmunity, you're done. It's just a matter of when. So we are funding a very large general population study over in Europe where we're going to screen between 300 and 350,000 newborns. We're going to genetically type them all, and those who are at risk to develop type 1, we're going to enroll them in a clinical trial, and we're going to intervene with a drug at 3 months of age prior to autoimmunity, and we're going to intervene for probably about 3 years and then follow them. And the goal really is to create a platform that we can use to screen for many other diseases. It's a very ambitious project. We're doing it to intervene in children at 3 to 6 months of age is very difficult to do. For anybody who's done clinical trials, you know this already. And we're doing it in 5 countries across Europe. And the goal really is to be able to use type 1 as a proof of concept. And what we really would love to be able to do down the road, once we get our proof of concept, is go to other diseases that occur early in life and begin to screen across multiple diseases. We're drawing the blood anyway. There's so many other things that we should be doing. It seems insane to do this for just type 1, but I found that when you go to people with an idea and you lay out the idea and you ask for money, you end up getting advice. And it's really frustrating from my standpoint. It works much better when you go, have a proof of concept, say here's a platform, it works, we've done it in type 1, and already people are hearing about it. They just started screening over in Germany. The other 4 countries will come online over the next few months, and we're already getting phone calls of other organizations that are looking to have a conversation with us. And we say, give us a year, let us get our proof of concept done, and we'd be happy to have the conversation. But we're really focused on not just building the platform for us, but for the entire community. We just use type 1 as the proof of concept.
Mm-hmm. So I want to pivot towards timeframes, because something like that takes a lot of time. I want to go to Todd, to you. I think one of the assets philanthropy has as currency is hope. So if a longitudinal study takes decades to really show some efficacy, as a donor, don't I expect the cure to come more quickly? Or is there something that takes hope away by saying we need to fund these very long-term studies, and how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think this is definitely a challenge, particularly I think for the public charities. And one way that we look at it is to have a portfolio of activities. So you have some portion of your funding and activities that are focused on sort of high risk, high payoff, shorter term projects, but you also want to make sure that you're investing in sort of the next generation of therapies and these longitudinal type studies. And I think it's very important, David and I were talking about this, to have a realistic conversation with people too, because no one wants to be sold false hope either. And we know that these trials take time and they have to be based on science as well. So I do think this is a critical challenge, and it's good to have a portfolio of activities, but be realistic about what really needs to get done to have the real breakthroughs, and having this critical data on the patient population is really needed. So.
And you've been, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to add one quick thing, and that is, this is another example of this clinical trial platform that's going to cost an absurd amount of money that the public charities really can't do because it's tough to fundraise off of. And again, I think that's the role of philanthropy, is to understand where these gaps are, and we should be stepping up and filling those gaps.
And LaTese, when you're advising people on what to fund, once you've done that as landscape, so taking what Todd just said into account, there are going to be longer term initiatives that require a lot more patience, right, than some of the shorter term. How do you think about dispersing funds across that continuum?
Yeah. So, you know, it's difficult, right? Because they come in with these, again, it's passion capital you're passionate about and you want to see change now. But we talk a lot about, you know, with folks, the difference between your mission and your vision, right? So really walking it back to understand, so what is your vision? Your vision is something like we want type 1 diabetes to not exist anymore. Your mission is how do you accomplish that? And so that's sort of how we frame that conversation, because then you can get to sort of that time horizon and say, well, you know, one of the things that will contribute to that vision is these longitudinal studies that will take 10 years, you know, and it's, you know, sometimes donors are still just like, well, that's too long, you know, it doesn't fit their time horizon, it doesn't fit their risk appetite, and that's fine. And so, you know, we talk through that because, you know, to the point, it's just like the, you know, your investment portfolio, right? You need to diversify. And so it's, you know, we need the donors who can't stomach that long time horizon as well as those that can. And so, you know, and what we've seen is when you try to force a donor into that, it doesn't work well. You know, it just doesn't. The other point I want to make, and just sort of to go back to a couple things that I heard, but you were talking about, you know, you give your money, but you also, there are other things that you as a philanthropist can give, right? So it's not just, we think about it as the 4 T's. So it's your treasures, which is your money, but it's also your talent. So what expertise do you bring to the table? Your time, of course, because, you know, when you're an engaged philanthropist, it takes time. You know, that passive philanthropy of writing a check and hoping for the best, you know, that takes a lot less time, but then you're just hoping and wishing and praying. You know, so it's your treasure, it's your time, it's your talent. You know, all those things really, really go towards having a very balanced perspective, and we see that in this what we're calling this next generation philanthropist. So it's not just putting a check on the table and hoping for the best.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. In fact, one of the conversations that we have at every board meeting, once we approve a grant, they were like, okay, well, that's the money. Now what are we doing to help besides the money? That's always what the board wants to know, because that's what makes us unique. If we're not playing all of those keys on Jeff's keyboard to a problem, then, you know, we're just adding money that any other philanthropist could have came in and added that money. The other thing that we quickly saw during Ebola, there was a Vanity Fair event that was happening in September here in San Francisco. So Jeff took the advantage of a lot of people being in town, and we had a convening at the Four Seasons Hotel, very spontaneous. A lot of heads of the Silicon Valley companies, other people were here, who said, it's got to be more than money. We're all giving money. You know, what are you doing in Silicon Valley to solve this issue? And people are like, They're trying to track people for 21 days who are landing in 5 different airports in the US. That's when we also realize we're not even talking together enough as philanthropists. So even though, we were out there working on pandemics, probably in the first 5 years, we worked with Gates and Rockefeller because they're 2 big global health giants, but it's not because they were necessarily interested in pandemics per se. But now, post-Ebola, there's lots of people, including the great Chan Zuckerberg Biohub, to work on all diseases, which include infectious diseases. We now convene every month a phone call that's up to 14 different foundations and high net worth organizations that are literally, we are trying to coordinate what we're doing in the field of pandemics and epidemics, and we get together twice a year. We've had 6 in-person meetings now, so that's a chance for us to really make sure to try to cut down on the competition. We know every NGO out there, we know there are thousands, they're going to the same people for money. Well, if we're not even coordinated on what is our big picture as a philanthropic community, then we're not really serving our clients as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think, as I said before, money often isn't the problem. There's plenty of money. And if you could figure out a way to catalyze some of the $30 trillion that is sitting in accounts around the world earning 0%, if we thought of something for that to have an invested opportunity. So that brings me back to you, Dave, on the investment side. So you noted that Michael J. Fox vetted an investment for you. When you think about how organizations like his and others might invest some of their capital, this notion of the recyclability of philanthropic capital coming back. How do the exit strategies play out on that? And is there sometimes a conflict between what a private equity firm would want and a philanthropy?
Well, I think you raise an important question. That is there an evolution in the investment attitude? And I think the clear answer is yes. Program-related investments, which count towards the 5% payout requirement, count. So there is an opportunity to make investments that count towards the philanthropic tithing, if you will. But also there is a sense, and I see this particularly for new philanthropists, that they want to evergreen their own money. They want to make strategic investments where there's a return. That's not the thing that's motivating the project, but it's a bonus for the project. So if you look at the most recent data that I saw today from Penn, Gates between 2010 and 2015 did program-related investments of $200 million. The total philanthropic PRI, also mission-related investments, was $1.3 billion in that 5-year time period. That's enough money to matter. Mm-hmm. And if you think about philanthropy as being somewhere between a PT boat and a destroyer, and you think of the large public charities as being aircraft carriers, they're kind of slow, hard to move around, and then you think of the Department of the Navy as NIH. It's important that NIH be part of the conversation, and they need more money. Yeah. But they also need to cooperate and partner. And I think particularly with Francis Collins over the last several years, the new projects, All of Us and other data sharing. So that's one point. The second point is I would not ignore the leadership capability from philanthropy. The opportunity, use the Parker Institute, we have a common institutional review board for all of our centers. And it's 15% of all the patients enrolled in cancer clinical trials in the United States. So guess who wants to do a partnership? Jeff Conklin and Bristol Myers Squibb. Guess who else might want to do it is some other company, and then the companies who are selling tools in the cancer space want to donate their equipment. And so pretty soon you have the best institutions, the best availability of products from the for-profit sector, and you can spin off some companies, invest in the companies, and get a return. So I think the business model in philanthropy is changing in almost unfathomable ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rich, if I can just jump in real fast. So we're doing a lot more of PRIs and more so in type 1 diabetes. We're not really an orphan disease, but we're not type 2. I always say we're in this tweener land where most industry dollars is going to chase the type 2 therapies. So we use a lot of the PRIs to entice industry to play in our space and get out in front of them and de-risk it. So it's less about the return and more about getting them to go where we want them to go. And to be determined whether it works. We've done 3 of them already. We've got 3 more in the works. And it's a lot of the folks are coming to the table. In addition to, hopefully we bring a little bit more to the table than just money, but relationships and access and expertise. And hopefully a handoff to other investors further down the road.
But that ability to de-risk is important.
So one other comment about this evolving model. Intellectual property is a big carrot, and it's an impediment. So on the carrot side of the equation, increasingly academic institutions are realizing that they're not actually set up to facilitate the passage of a discovery across the valley of death into a product that patients see. And so that translational work, some of it's happening at NIH, and some of it's increasingly happening in creating incubators and then accelerators of products that come out of incubators. That's an opportunity for the private equity venture community to come together. So philanthropy helps fund the basic discovery, IP is created, managed, and then you spin it into companies that get sold to larger people who can do the later stage trials. So the ecosystem or the evolution is really changing pretty dramatically.
I agree.
And that's that notion of where philanthropy can step in, right? I don't think it necessarily means to be, I write you a check, right? So there's a lot of other new tools that are emerging that I think are quite effective. A pivot to Todd, you've been at Michael J. Fox for 13 years. So in other types of charitable work, if we were going to build a wing on a museum, right, we would have a capital campaign, and then when we were done, we'd be done, and there would be some conclusion. How do you, as a leader of the organization, motivate your team? Because absent a cure, you need to develop some other means to say that we're making progress here. So tell us about the challenges and things that you've employed as a leader.
Yeah, I mean, this is hard when you set your goal to get rid of a disease, like David was saying, but there are certainly very key milestones along the way and metrics that you see as progress. So one of the examples, when you do an early, identify a company and give early money to that company and then see it's been picked up, it's now at Big Pharma, it's moved into phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, that is a success along the way. I mean, you ultimately want it to get across the goal line, but you need to try to break it down a little bit and see how are you really seeing in how the field kind of moves like this, step forward, steps back, but just looking at the momentum and seeing how the field is changing, new directions that are happening. But it is a challenge because your ultimate metric is you want to be out of business. I mean, that's our goal. My goal would prefer we didn't have a foundation and he gets to go back to acting, right? He doesn't want to be dealing with this. So that's our goal, but we really want to try to see along the way, have we brought new partners in? Is there more activity in the field? How can we see that at least we're getting closer to that goal?
And this notion of collaboration that keeps coming up, I think at all of our events, we have sort of this instant collaboration when Mike does his quiz questions. So all of a sudden, people that you've never met before quickly congeal as a team and don't really care like who owns the IP or what's going on with that. And then, so when philanthropy has an opportunity to understand the root causes of some of these things, like when does that collaboration dissipate? Like when are society or business or whatever putting up those blockades around people that makes it unpalatable to lean into the other and collaborate, right? We have to understand there is a system that's created that. Yeah, I mean,
It's something I talk about with our group is that we love collaboration. We want there to be competition. So you sort of to realize, like in our case, when the companies that are working on a certain target are all talking to us, that means they've run into a problem. So we can get them to kind of collaborate. When they go silent on us again, I actually start to think that's a good thing, because that means it's like off to the races. So I think also trying to figure out what challenges, what scientific questions do you want a collaborative approach, but you also do want every company racing to get the drug across the goal line first. Mm-hmm. So that balance, I think, is important to not, cut off the competitive nature of, even in the academic space, you want them to be getting the first paper and the first discovery, because that's what motivates people. So that balance is tricky.
And when you, David, when you first encountered diabetes, there was JDRF, there were other organizations. Like, why didn't you just decide to partner with one of those on that competition side?
Yeah, so you always do this to me and put me on the spot. So look, the cynical side of me came into the equation saying, look, this organization's been around for 30-something years. Their one job is to put themselves out of business. They must be doing something wrong. I was extremely naive, and after 8 months, I realized curing disease is not so easy, and you have to do a little bit work with it. So, it's not really a fair assessment. But I also said to myself, we really need to try a different model. And we spent 18 months traveling around and learning before we ever wrote our first check. And I continue to travel around and learn. So I really think that at this point, we started out with JDRF, it was the public charity in our space, and there was some real friction. I mean, I've told you, it was like being frenemies, and it was bizarre to me because they were started by parents of children with type 1 diabetes that wanted the same exact thing that I wanted. Yet there was this palpable friction in everything that we did. And I think what they were very concerned about is if we didn't just partner with them on everything, that we would do something really innovative and their name wouldn't be a part of it. And then they'd have a bunch of constituents whining and complaining, hey, why weren't you a part of this? How did Helmsley figure that out? Instead of true partners, in my mind, true partners do, you're good at this piece, I'm good at this piece, we'll meet in the middle. We're now, I'd say we're much closer to true partners than frenemies. There's still some bumps and it's not perfect, but we get along much better. We're completely transparent with them and they are with us. But I would look at it this way. If we just wrote a check, we would be using JDRF as the funnel of ideas. I now have my own team with 4 or 5 PhDs, an engineer, a couple MPHs on staff, and our own stable of consultants, and we're our own funnel. And we come down with ideas, and we'll oftentimes compare with JDRF, we'll oftentimes co-fund with them. But I think it's better to have 2 sets of independent thoughts, and then figure out whether there's something to have a conversation about in the middle. I also think it really goes down to understanding our role in the ecosystem. And the public charities have some constraints because of fundraising. We're fortunate enough to not have those constraints, and I believe that obligates us to think differently. Much higher risk, much further out on the risk curve, doing the projects that I've already highlighted as things that they can't do because of the constraints of their model. And I think it took me a couple years to understand what my role was, and I'm not exactly a shrinking violet, so it tends to, we butted heads quite a bit for the first year or two, but I think we have a working relationship that's really good now.
So, Mark, when you think about partnerships, and you gave us an example where you involved governments and things like that. So I guess 2 questions. One, when you think about the risks you're trying to address, if Ebola had broken out in a part of the world that had more geopolitical tension, so if it was in Syria, right, what kind of risk does that portend if we weren't able to, even though it was a slow response, if we weren't even able to get there in 8 months? And then how do you go about engaging large systems like governments in being partners in the solution?
Sure. Well, many of you might be surprised to know that one of the longest standing public health collaborations exists between Israel, Palestine, and Jordan since 2003. That was a project started by Ted Turner and Sam Nunn when I was at the Nuclear Threat Initiative that, to get back to the question of collaboration as well, I mean, one of the things that has helped me in the work that I've done for all 3 foundations that I've had a chance to work for is the lack of ego and the lack of wanting any credit for the work that was being done. Because you can believe that the 18 members of the board of NTI wanted to tell the success story of Israel and Palestine and Jordan sitting around, going from Israel being the only one who could diagnose any diarrheal disease in the region to today, not only can all 3 partners diagnose every single disease using the same technology for things beyond just diarrheal, that was something the board had to live with, because the moment we would tell the world that was going would be the moment the partners said they would have to stop. So part of collaboration really is putting the egos aside, and thank God I've always worked for people who have felt the work was way more important than our role within that. That being said, you have to be a partner through the whole process, because the best collaborations we have, and for us, the government is number one. We don't start a single project in any country unless we have cleared every avenue with the government, because ultimately we're trying to find and report disease outbreaks, and the government, unfortunately, is the only one responsible for whatever happens within their border when it comes to those issues. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean the government is the only answer to the solution. And in places like Syria and other countries where it's difficult to work with the government, that's when we're working with community health workers. We're working with humanitarian organizations. We just need eyes and ears on the ground, and we have to be creative with today's technology that everybody can help us find outbreaks faster. And that's what's really exciting. And our friends in Thailand have taught us, it's not community-based surveillance for them, it's community-owned surveillance, and that's the term that they use. And where we've started in countries on disease surveillance, these projects have flourished into reporting counterfeit drugs, food safety, environmental concerns. Brazil did the first ever participatory surveillance for mass gatherings at the World Cup, the Olympics, and the Paralympics. For the first time ever, everybody who went to the games in Brazil reported every single day whether they had any of 10 symptoms that were monitored in real time by the government to see whether any outbreaks were to happen. And for mass gatherings, the fact that we could follow people up, if a case of measles were identified on the last day of the Olympics and people went to 150 countries back home, well, you can now inform them of a risk that they had. So we're really changing the way we think about public health because of the fact that, for us, no community is too hard to reach. No country is too poor to innovate. And we have found that curiosity outshines fear if you just give a chance for that innovation to happen locally.
Okay. So, LaTese, you have done deep dives across a spectrum of different diseases. When you think of collaboration incentives that have worked, are there opportunities to cross-pollinate between the diseases you've studied, and what has been the most effective way to catalyze that collaboration?
Yeah, there are definitely opportunities for, cross-disease, cross-discipline, fill in the blank. So we've talked a lot about data, right? I think we're probably all tired of hearing about data at this point. But that is it's one of the things that comes up, and pick your favorite disease, and that's an issue. Whether it's data in the context of a registry or a biorepository or just research data that's generated, and how do we share it, and not have to wait the, 18 plus months until someone publishes it. But these are big, big issues. And so when you bring people together, and you take, again, you pick your favorite disease out of the conversation and just say, you need a platform, you need a platform, and you need a platform. Let's sit around and talk about what that'll look like. What do you need out of it? What do you need out of it? And figure out the commonality, right? So to your point, you're doing blood draws from a whole bunch of babies, right? So what else can we be doing with that? And I'll say that, there are a lot of people in this, a lot of folks in this next generation of philanthropy, whether it's an individual, whether it's a foundation, that they really do want to leverage, initiatives and other funding that's out there, right? Sometimes there is a disconnect between the fact that you want to leverage something, but that requires you to collaborate. And so, really helping people work through that. You want to get the most out of your investment, fantastic. you need this platform. Again, just using data as an example, fantastic. So let's come together and talk about how we can make that happen so you don't have to spend the $100 million. Maybe you spend 25 and you get some frenemies and y'all work that out over some turkey or something. And, we can all get what we need. In the context of the researchers, unfortunately, and I say this as a previous researcher, the behavior is changing, that anti-collaborative behavior is changing, but I still feel like it's too slow. It's a system that is not really set up for researchers to actively want to collaborate because of the whole publish or perish model. And so, as philanthropists, really thinking about, okay, how can we shift that behavioral change a little bit faster? And, it's simple.
Blow it up and start over.
That, right? Or you do what Mike did and just say, well, you know what? You don't get my money if you don't share. So you can have several seats, or you can come get this check. And I encourage everyone not to be afraid to do that, just because, and we see this sometimes. Philanthropists, they have a deference towards the scientist or the clinician or whoever, and while there should be healthy respect on both sides, use the carrots that you have, right? And understand that is, while you are, incentivizing that behavioral change by writing a check, or while you're incentivizing collaboration by writing a check, that impact is bigger because you're creating an overall systemic behavioral change.
All right, so Kim's giving me the eye. So
just to add quickly about the cross-disease collaborations. We're actually seeing a lot of ways it's easier on the foundation side to do cross-disease collaborations than within a disease for a lot of the reasons that David was mentioning that happen within a disease. But one of the things that I think is happening, based on some of the discussions earlier today, is that the definitions of these diseases are changing because they're becoming more protein or biologically based as opposed to clinical. And there are a lot of overlaps now where the same gene or protein is being implicated across diseases in a way that you wouldn't have predicted. So we're having a lot of interactions with other neurodegenerative diseases on common mechanisms to try to support research, and they've gone pretty well, because there's not as much ego involved, I think, across diseases than within disease, believe it or not.
Can I add on that point
So
real
let's
quick?
do the final question, because we're running out of time. So
You just gonna cut me off?
say it. I did. After
he's
you
the boss.
volunteered, too. Go ahead.
You just roped her in. You got to
Well,
let her answer.
I just want to put out one point that we haven't really touched, which is around.
You saying I'm a bad moderator? Go ahead and touch
I am not saying that
Check,
because you
please.
signed my paycheck. You're making me forget my point now. But it's around sort of that cross, disease collaboration. And Todd, your point with using neurodegeneration as an example, we just did a major convening on tau, or tauopathy, which, if you know what that is, kudos to you, that's awesome. But it's a protein that collects in the brain that's been implicated in a number of neurodegenerative diseases. And, the point that I want to make is that we've talked about funding translational research, but as we think about, these cross-disease challenges that remain, neurodegeneration in particular, part of the reason we haven't really been as successful as we'd like is because there are basic things about the basic mechanism of the disease that we don't understand. And while we've been, running out of gate towards clinical trials and this and that target, sometimes we got to go back to basics. And so I encourage you all to keep in mind that while translational research and funding that is important, it's also important to diversify your portfolio and make sure that you continue to fund basic research, but look for the innovative things, right? So research paradigm shifts, right? So Alzheimer's, we've been focused on, A beta and tau. What are the other things that we could be focused on? So I just wanted to make that point of, it's not just basic, it's not just translational, it's not just clinical, diversify.
Okay. So I want to end on an optimistic note. So you've all been at this for quite a while. So what is the one thing that the biggest change that's been positive since you entered this fray of philanthropy? We'll start with you, David.
Oh boy. I'd say that we have created a data set now that has awoken both the payers and the FDA to the fact that in our disease state, we're not doing as well as we should have. And that has created a huge sense of urgency within the FDA, as well as the payers. And for us, the FDA is really the key, because they were, I'd say 5 years ago, they were a constraint. Now I'd say they're very much an enabler.
Okay, LaTese?
So I would say in the context of philanthropy and medical research, just a trend around, philanthropists and foundations really, really wanting to be more strategic, so not just wanting to do the conventional grant making, RFP, but really taking the time to step back and think about what are some other strategies that we can, employ to really get this done faster, and create sort of runways to collect ideas from other people.
Okay, Mark?
I think for me, it's really the growth in new philanthropists who really do want to get their hands dirty and want to see, real action. And, for us, we're essentially an operational foundation. And when we look at, and we just did an analysis over the grants we gave in the last 5 years, and 3 out of every 4 were directly initiated, direct partnerships with us that gave us the results we wanted versus the other 25%. Which were more traditional, where we gave grants to organizations, that were aligned with our mission. But that's where I think the future is going in philanthropy, is really being much more operational, much more hands-on. And then for us, the biggest change in public health is really, quite frankly, just putting the public back into public health. And it's helping us think about disease surveillance in ways that, was just not possible as short as 5 years ago.
Good. David?
In 2012, Siddhartha Mukherjee wrote a book, Emperor of All Maladies, about cancer. And in that book, cancer immunotherapy wasn't in it. Nor was CRISPR-Cas9. The first clinical trial in the United States using CRISPR-Cas9 will take place with money from the Parker Institute at Penn. So the speed of adoption is possible through philanthropy, in maybe even in preference to, or in an accelerated way compared to industry or government. I think that's pretty optimistic.
At least in the Parkinson's space, what we're optimistic about is that we are actually seeing the leading edge of a more personalized therapeutic approach, where there's trials that are recruiting people with Parkinson's based on genetic status. And about 20 years ago, Parkinson's was thought to have no genetic cause. So I think just seeing how the field is moving, and we hope to be as advanced as in some other diseases, but this is an important step forward.
Okay, yeah. Great. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us on the panel. I want to thank all of you for joining us at Partnering for Cures, and we look forward to seeing you again. Kim's going to